This is Kurt from Madison ModPo. On my left is Scott, on my immediate right is Roger, and far right is Jim. And today we're going to talk about Lawrence Ferlinghetti's poem. This was part of Coney Island of the Mind, where Mr. Ferlinghetti says, of these 7 poems, which Dog is one of them, says these 7 poems were conceived specifically for jazz accompaniment, and as such should be considered as spontaneously spoken oral messages rather than as poems written for the printed page. Let's just listen to Mr. Ferlinghetti recite the poem.
A poem about a dog I see walking around North Beach all the time. The dog trots freely in the street and sees reality, and the things he sees are bigger than himself. And the things he sees are his reality. Drunks in doorways, moons on trees. The dog trots freely through the street, and the things he sees are smaller than himself. Fish on newsprint, ants in holes, chickens in Chinatown windows, their heads a block away. The dog trots freely in the street, and the things he smells smell something like himself. The dog trots freely in the street, past puddles and babies, cats and cigars, pool rooms and policemen. He doesn't hate cops, he merely has no use for them. And he goes past them and past the dead cows hung up whole in front of the San Francisco meat market. He would rather eat a tender cow than a tough policeman, though either might do. And he goes past the Romeo Ravioli factory, and past Coit's Tower, and past Congressman Doyle of the Un-American Activities Committee. He's afraid of Coit's Tower, but he's not afraid of Congressman Doyle, although what he hears is very discouraging, very depressing, very absurd to a sad young dog like himself, to a serious dog like himself. But he has his own free world to live in, his own peace to eat. He will not be muzzled. Congressman Doyle is just another fire hydrant to him. The dog trots freely in the street and has his own dog's life to live and to think about and to reflect upon, touching and tasting and testing everything, investigating everything without benefit of perjury. A real realist with a real tale to tell, and a real tale to tell it with. A real live barking democratic dog engaged in real free enterprise with something to say about ontology, something to say about reality and how to see it and how to hear it, with his head cocked sideways at street corners as if he is always just about to have his picture taken for Victor Records, listening for his master's voice and looking like a living question mark into the great gramophone of puzzling existence, with its wondrous hollow horn which always seems just about to spout forth some victorious answer to everything.
Why don't we start with some of the geographical references and biographical references here in the poem. Romeo Ravioli Factory, San Francisco Meat Market. I'm told those things don't exist anymore in San Francisco, but Coit's Tower does. And that tower, I am told, was a memorial to the victims of the 1906 earthquake. And I have not seen it. What does it look like?
It looks like if you've used all the toilet paper and you only have the tube left, that's pretty much what they're down.
Think of a shorter leaning tower of Pisa that's not leaning.
It's very white.
Yeah.
Very white.
Well,
Could one compare it to a fire hydrant?
no.
No, all right. A critic actually tried to suggest that.
I mean, you know, it's on one of the hills. San Francisco has a number.
It's very prominent.
Extremely noticeable. And also, as I mentioned, there are WPA murals inside Court Tower, which sort of dedicates it, and in a way sort of dedicates the whole city of San Francisco to a working class ideal. At a fairly long period of time, San Francisco's industry was that it was a port city, and it was, the comings and goings and the loading and unloading. That's what San Francisco's really all about.
Well, we should also talk about Congressman Doyle. We know Ferlinghetti specifically added a line to a later version of the poem that the congressman was part of the House Un-American Activities Committee. Is that the right term?
Yes, it is.
HUAC,
And it was
yeah.
created in 1938.
And Doyle served on it. I think he was appointed from 1951 until his death in 1963. So he was there at the time that McCarthy was there. Unless that was Senator McCarthy. So this would have been the House version of Senator McCarthy's Senate committee. So it was a time of a lot of repression and people being blacklisted. It was, by all accounts, it's an ugly time. Well, let's go back and take a look at the poem itself. The title, Dog, it's not a dog or the dog, it's just dog. I'm not sure there's a significance to that. But we do have repeated in the poem, the dog trots freely in the street. And it's used several places, under moons on trees. The line before it next is their head's a block away. Smells something like himself. And on the second page of our version, the dog trots freely in the street is underneath fire hydrant to him. We also, it's curious in this line, not only does the repetition give structure to the poem, but the use of the word freely is interesting too. So freely in one sense means the absence of restraint, but in another sense it has political dimensions. And if we look at our second page, but he has his own free world to live in contrast to the communist menace at the time, as it was called. And there's a reference to free enterprise as well in the latter part of the poem. So do you think, which version do you guys think is more important? The without restraint, or is there a political side to this poem?
Definitely political in every way, because for one thing, Ferlinghetti was you might say he was a celebrity of the left, and his 100th birthday was celebrated recently. It was the amount of attention that he got, basically worldwide, but certainly in his own town. At some point, he was referred to as the mayor of San Francisco.
Well, and his bookstore, City Lights Bookstore, which he founded, I think in the early 50s, is still in business today. It's iconic. I believe San Francisco listed it as a historical building.
Yeah, they did.
And in addition to his poetry, Ferlinghetti is known for being brave enough to have published Allen Ginsberg's poem, Howl. The other thing I noticed here is he repeats the word reality. Second line, the dog sees reality. A little bit down from there, the things he sees are his reality. Another reference, if I can find it. We see him on the second page, a real realist, a real tale to tell it with.
Real free enterprise.
And then there's another reference about ontology, something to say about reality. What do you think he's doing there?
Well, seeing reality is seeing it as an innocent. There's no preconceptions by society or culture, whatever you want to say, about things in our existence. It's like a dog looking at a chair. A human being would look at a chair and it would be the design and how much it cost and so on and so forth. And a dog sees it as an object without all of this baggage that we bring to it, we being human beings.
Right.
So that's why I go back to, in a bigger sense, that's why I see the dog being a suggested substitute for man. The way man should go through existence is to see reality for what it is without all the baggage that goes with it. Does that make any sense?
It most certainly does, and I like what you're saying. And we can come back to that point just as another thought occurs to me, though, before I forget it, and that is Ferlinghetti's love and use of wordplay through the poem. We see him he'd rather eat a tender cow than a tough policeman, tough being a tough cop, or tough being the quality of the meat. We have, on the next page, he will not be muzzled by Congressman Doyle. Muzzled in the sense of the repression of free speech, or muzzled like a dog gets muzzled. Just as two examples. Or real realist, real tale to tell it with the different spellings of tale. That aspect, I enjoy the humor of that.
Yeah, and it underscores the again of how one should go through existence is with this. There's a certain jolliness, if that's a word, to way one should proceed. It reminds me of the time that I was living in San Francisco, and if I wasn't in rehearsal, I would wander around the city just observing it without...
You were the dog.
I was the dog. I was the dog in this poem in San Francisco in the 80s.
Well, we also have, I like from the dog's perspective, just up front, the details that he sees. And it's without judgment or baggage, just like you say, trunks and doorways. Moons on trees, I think, is a reference to street lamps. And how he structures things and the things he sees. Another repetition that he uses, or sometimes he'll say, and the things he smells. But anyway, so getting back to the dog's perspective, things are bigger than himself, smaller than himself, fish on newsprint, ants in holes. From the dog's perspective, it's all kind of mysterious and wonderful. You have this fish there to grab, you have chickens to smell, and Ferlinghetti does reference the five senses. We have smelling, seeing, tasting, hearing, thank you, touching, which is a nice way to also give structure to the poem, I think. But so we're following a certain path here of verse structure. Short lines, straight down the left side margin. And then we get to a different part of the poem where all of a sudden these lines break apart and there are gaps in the lines, and it has a different feel to it.
He's this aimless critter who becomes a barking democratic
I love
dog.
that line.
Yeah.
And what does that mean in this context? Is this all of a sudden, maybe getting to what Scott was saying, before we had this dog that was just doing its thing, but now if you introduce some of these other concepts, that simple world, just like the simple structure of the lines, breaks apart.
We'll take the end of it, just about to spout forth some victorious answer to everything, some great insight into reality. Earlier on, he's this aimless creature just using his senses to navigate this environment, but now piercing through deeply and seeing some truth.
Yeah, just as I like the last image a lot, and those of us of a certain age can remember the record label and seeing this, but this was the image of the dog peering in, which I found on old 78 records at our cottage, Victrola, which we never used, but it gave me a glimpse into a world past. And I think that last reference to Victorious is a play on Victrola.
Yep. Yep.
Just about to spout forth some victorious answer to everything.
Well, it's like organized religion or political structure or the consumption of things.
Or the corruption of corporate capitalism.
Yes. Precisely. I think spout forth is a very cynical, bitter kind of word for me, and staring into the abyss, expecting an answer, some universal truth to come out. It's this leap of faith that we were talking about earlier.
Well, it seems very sardonic or sarcastic.
Yes, sardonic. Yes.
Some victorious answer to everything.
Yeah.
Not. I wanted to point out something else which I just saw today as we were talking about the poem. Just as the House Un-American Committee, or House of Un-American
Activities Committee.
Thank you, Jim, is investigating everything. Ferlinghetti includes on page 2, touching, tasting, testing everything, investigating everything without benefit of perjury. It's just a nice
Nice image.
nice contrast, nice commentary. You like the poem?
I love it.
And I guess that begs the question, what do you find so attractive about it?
Well, I think he projects a personality in this poem, and you can understand what this guy was like, what he thought about, what he felt. I was lucky enough to, Ferlinghetti, besides being a poet, was an artist. And he had an opening in New York that I went to, and he was there, everybody was just falling over themselves, congratulating themselves that they were there at this opening. But anyway, he was a person of enormous charm and affability, and I think that in so many different ways, I mean, the very fact that he lived he's still alive and he's 100 years old, sort of amazes me.